I call Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr Speaker, I'm standing to speak to the Child Protection Child Sex Offender Register Bill, and as my colleague Jacinda Ardern pointed out, we will be supporting this to Select Committee, Mr Speaker. We are concerned about the fact that it is coming to the Social Services Select Committee. I don't mind considering this bill being on the Social Services Select Committee, but we do wonder whether or not, because it is a criminal justice issue, whether it should actually have been sent to the Justice Select Committee or the Law and Order Select Committee, Mr Speaker. I just want to acknowledge that across the House, every single one of us would recognise this is a major issue. Mr Speaker, I think it's important to look at a few of the facts that we see in the regulatory impact statement, facts that we should all be concerned about. Facts like child sexual abuse is a serious problem in New Zealand. In 2012 to 13, 505 offenders were convicted of 1,819 sex offences against children, up by over 20% from a decade earlier. We heard from the other side earlier that crime's down, but when you hear those statistics and see that sexual offences against children are 20% up from a decade earlier, then, Mr Speaker, we should be concerned. In 2012-2013, the Accident Compensation Corporation had 779 sensitive claims for sexual abuse lodged for children under the age of 16 years. And, Mr Speaker, these are just the cases that actually led to conviction. We know, because of the research, that there are thousands of cases of child sexual abuse out there every year that don't get reported, let alone lead to a conviction. Mr Speaker, child victims of sexual abuse are amongst the most vulnerable victims of crime, and the resultant harm is often very serious and long-lasting. These are things that we can agree on in the House, Mr Speaker. My concern, and I'll be asking questions about this when it comes to Select Committee, is actually around the rehabilitation side with respect to sexual offenders, Mr Speaker. I'm really interested to know, and I will be really interested to know, and we'll be digging down on this, how successful the rehabilitation programs are that we have in place, particularly the ones that are run in our jails. What are the results? What is the research there, Mr Speaker? What do we need to know as parliamentarians about this, and what do the public need to know? And where do we need to be investing more funding, more resource, if the rehabilitation programs that we have in place are not successful? Mr Speaker, I was recently quite disturbed by a case in West Auckland where a person was caught by the police in the library sexually offending against a child. Not only was that disturbing, Mr Speaker, but what was particularly disturbing was that that particular person was working in the capacity as a social worker for a social service in West Auckland and had committed a similar crime 25 years earlier, and yet was still able to work in that position of social worker and was able to re-offend. Mr Speaker, I'm going to go down the track of talking about the need to have a qualified and registered workforce working with our children, as my colleague Jacinda alluded to before, and I'm going to take this opportunity to bring up the fact that a report that recently came out highlighted the need to have a more qualified workforce working with vulnerable children. Mr Speaker, tomorrow in the House we have a Members' Day, and my bill will be coming up, and it's moving towards mandatory registration of social workers. Now, I bring this up because I'm reflecting on that particular social worker in West Auckland who sexually offended against a young child in the library who was working for a social service at the time in the capacity of social worker, Mr Speaker. Unfortunately, all too often, the people who are committing these offences are either family members or they are people in trusted positions. So, Mr Speaker, I think that we have a moral obligation as a parliament to make sure that we are holding the people to account who are in those trusted positions working with vulnerable children. So I'm hoping tomorrow that the National Government will consider supporting my member's bill to make social worker registration mandatory. Mr Speaker, we are not opposed to certain types of information sharing between departments. In this case, it would be corrections and police. But there are concerns, though, about how information will be shared. Antoli has said that in some cases where there is a significant threat to the safety of children, information from the register may be released to a third party, such as the parent or guardian of a child or a teacher or caregiver responsible for a child. I guess my concern with that, Mr Speaker, is that the national government, the speakers on the bill have said on one hand that this will not be a public register. The register will not apparently be public but available to authorised police, correction staff and authorised staff from relevant agencies such as the Ministry of Social Development and Housing New Zealand. And then, Mr Speaker, though, we have Antoli, the Minister of Social Development, saying that where there is a significant threat to the safety of children, information from the register may be released to a third party, such as the parent or guardian of a child or a teacher or caregiver. And I guess we're just seeking clarification on that, because actually if that information is going to the third party, such as the examples that have been given here, then actually, Mr Speaker, it is going public. So on one hand, to say that this register won't be public and it will only be going to these agencies, and then on the other to say that in some circumstances it can go to a third party, including guardian of a child or a teacher or caregiver, then it becomes really blurred, because is this a public register or is this not a public register? And if it is a public register, then the government really need to name that and be very transparent about that. But at the moment, I'm a little bit concerned that it is a little murky, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I just want to point out the fact that there should be a mechanism for review to be removed from the register. If they haven't offended in a very long time, this has been brought up. But this is something that we will need to discuss at Select Committee. There's so many issues digging down on this that we're going to have discussions about at the Select Committee, and that does take me back to my concern that is this well suited with the Social Services Select Committee, or as my colleague Jacinda Ardern pointed out earlier, would it have better fit with the Justice or Law and Order Select Committee, given that this really is a criminal justice issue? Mr Speaker, look, we take on board it is important to manage any risks to children and the community posed by convicted child sex offenders who have come to the end of their sentences or are serving non-custodial sentences. And we do accept that this bill will allow for the tracking of convicted child sex offenders in the community to be used as a tool to try and prevent reoffending. And if it does assist with preventing reoffending, then, Mr Speaker, of course we will support this. But we do need to acknowledge that this is not a silver bullet with respect to the issue that the very serious issue that we face as a country with child sex offenders and sex offences committed against children. There is much more that needs to be looked at. This is one possible way in which we can try and mitigate the risk, but it definitely is not the silver bullet to resolving the issues that we have in this country with sexual offences against children. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Todd